Because how do you put a value on the human lives lost, for example, because of British colonialism? The 35 million Indians who died totally unnecessary deaths in famines engineered by British policy, and all the other wrongs. So I said, you really can't put a price on it. Why don't you instead look for moral atonement or moral reparation and pay a symbolic £1 a year for the next 200 years to make up for the last 200. That was the argument I took in the debate. First of all, Indian rulers tended to be Indian and therefore fairly flexible, which meant that if, for example, there was a drought or there was a tragedy in the peasant's family, or for that matter, a happy occasion, a wedding in the family, taxes were either waived or reduced or postponed by, if you like, cultural habit in India, whereas the British prided themselves on doing everything by the book. By the book. And so there were no exceptions made. The book said this is what you had to pay, and it didn't matter whether you just lost your father or your child, or if you'd just celebrated, blown up all your savings and marrying off your daughter, whatever it was. No excuses. This is it. If it's a drought, it doesn't matter. All the more reason why you have to pay, because our revenues go down in the drought. And that was the British approach. The British didn't invest in local improvements. They sent the money back to Britain, and they kept detailed accounts. So that one of the interesting things about how easy it is to indict the British is because most of the facts and figures you use for British atrocities come from British sources. They maintained the accounts every year. All of this was completely publicly available. In writing my book, I was able to pore over a House of Commons testimonies in which the British themselves were talking about the stark realities of British rule in India. So I didn't need to look for nationalist sources when the British accounts of what went on with themselves so clearly self-inculpating, as it were, of what had gone wrong during British rule. I talked about famines, and I mentioned that example because people have tended to believe, largely as a result of late Victorian British propaganda, that famines are somehow endemic to India and that Indians are always dying like flies of starvation. Well, I think you have to know that is simply not true. There was not only a very different management of agricultural resources in India, but famines were actually caused and sustained by deliberate British policy. And the approach was predicated on three principles. The first was the Adam Smithian principle, if you like, that the free market must always prevail. So if a drought occurred, in the old days, the Indians would immediately compensate for the drought, reduce or abolish taxes, give charity, people rallied together, gave alms to the hungry, etc. And in any case, whatever little grain was there was available locally in that area. When the British came, during droughts, they were taking the available grain and sending it back to London for the bread baskets of Britain. And they said, that's the rule of the market. You know, those who can take the grain, the rules of the market will prevail. We will take it. And if that means that what little grain is left is not affordable for the poor, tough, that's market economics for you. That was principle number one. Principle number two was that charity is always bad, that it encourages idleness. This is an attitude that continued. Many of you who have read Charles Dickens know about the attitudes in the workhouses and so on. This was very much the attitude right through most of the 19th century. Charity was bad. Therefore, you shall not give any. And in fact, it was so strongly disapproved of by the British that I recount an episode during the Orissa famine of 1866 when a Mr. McMinn, who I assume was either Irish or Scottish, moved by the plight of people starving before his very eyes, tried to give some food to them and was severely reprimanded by the British officials who said that if you continue doing this, we will ship you back home, because you're not supposed to be giving charity to dying Indians. If they don't have food, let them die. That was official policy. And the third principle, of course, is good Victorian fiscal prudence. Thou shalt not spend money thou hast not budgeted for. And of course, you never budget for a famine. So the result is that the British, by actually worsening conditions during a drought, by prohibiting charity and by purchasing and shipping out the grain that was available, essentially created the famine, created the phenomenon of people dying, that something needed to be done. And so they did. They set up work camps. But what's absolutely striking is that the rations provided in these work camps are people who had to work. Still not idle charity. They had to work, however starving they were, for whatever grain they got. The rations provided were lower, in the estimate of a British scholar, Professor Mike Davies, who wrote a painful book called Late Victorian Holocaust about this, were lower than the rations given by the Nazis to the concentration camp inmates in Buchenwald before gassing them to death. So that was how British charity, such as it was, operated. But in India, there wasn't that option. You didn't have ships that would take you to America, so you ended up essentially dying. Now, in the 1940s, we had a reprise of this horrendous thing when Winston Churchill decided that when the drought and the famine broke out in Bengal in 1943, that instead of leaving grain in the markets there, the grain would be removed from Bengal and sent off to Europe, not to immediately aid in the war effort. World War II was going on at the time, but to bolster buffer stocks, reserve stocks, to be held in the event of a possible future invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia, which didn't happen till late 1944 anyway. But so the grain went off, and the usual British attitudes kicked in. Ships laden with wheat from Australia were calling at Calcutta port for refueling before carrying on, and they could have easily disembarked their wheat, and indeed a proposal was made that they should. But Churchill personally decided they would not do so. The starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis matters much less than that of sturdy Tommies, he said. Sturdy Greeks, I beg your pardon, he said, quote unquote. He was told that people were dying because of his decisions, and he said, "Oh, I hate Indians anyway. They're a beastly people with a beastly religion." Another exact quote is, "It's all their fault anyway for breeding like rabbits." This was the kind of attitude that Churchill had to what ended up being 4.3 million human beings dying between October 43 and about March of 44 in Bengal. And when conscience-stricken British officials in Calcutta sent a formal memorandum to the Prime Minister protesting these policies and saying people were dying because of them, all Churchill could bring himself to do was to write in the margin of the file, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" And this is the man whom the British expect the rest of the world to hail as the apostle of freedom and democracy, when we know him as really very, very little different from the likes of some of the worst genocidal dictators of the 20th century. There is a difference of degree. Hitler gassed 6 million, Churchill killed 4.3, but essentially it comes down to a difference of numbers and not in terms of human quality.